It's story time!
Hello and welcome to the Storytime Podcast, and today I have with me Nicola O Leary, and I just want to, before we jump into the podcast, just give you a little idea of what we're going to talk about today. So, content warning, we are going to be discussing like themes of abortion and stuff in Ireland, and this explains this jumper as well. In Ireland currently it is legislated for in our constitution abortion is illegal except in certain circumstances, and we are currently, there is a citizens assembly to review what it says in the constitution and whether or not we should change it and how we should change it. I personally am for repealing the 8th Amendment is what it's called. And yeah, so that's, I'll put links down in the description so you can get a more concise idea of what is going on at the minute, because it's a lot of information and I'm probably not the best place to get it from. So I'll put all the links down in the description to kind of the current state in Ireland and about the repeal campaign. But basically what it means in practical terms is that a lot of Irish women go to England to get abortions because it's illegal to do here. That fair?
Yeah.
And so you are here to tell us a story.
Yeah, and I think the reason I wanted to do this is because I think now we're at a really kind of pivotal point in Ireland where we have the opportunity to kind of change these archaic laws that were brought in kind of in the 80s. Like in our constitution, it's the only medical thing that's actually in our constitution, and it's our right kind of over women's bodies, and I really don't think it's fair that it has it in there. It should be legislative, it should be in law, whatever the people decide to do, but it really shouldn't be something that's kind of inbuilt into our constitution. So I just kind of wanted to come in, and I think it's really important that people kind of start telling their stories, because there are thousands of women going over to the UK every year, and a lot of them kind of don't have a voice because they feel like it's not okay, it's shamed, it's frowned upon, that they can't actually tell their story. And I just think it's really important for as many people as possible to tell their stories, just so people who've been lucky enough not to have to experience it understand kind of the ins and outs and kind of why it's important.
And I guess I feel it's fair to say that Ireland kind of has like a history of shaming women for things. So back in the day, unmarried mothers would have been put into mother and baby homes, Magdalene laundries. You know, I feel like it's kind of it's a continuation of a past Ireland, really, and it's I feel like it's changing the way in which it's shaming people, but it's still, there's a lot of shame around women's sexuality, women having babies and stuff, and we are progressing, but there's ways in particular this way I wish we were progressing a lot quicker.
And definitely, and if you look at how far forward Ireland has come in terms of the kind of the marriage equality referendum that kind of passed the year before last, which was amazing, and yet we're moving ahead in leaps and bounds in certain areas, but then in other areas then we're still kind of miles behind where we really should be, in particular, as you said, kind of around women and about kind of equality for women, which is really important. So
I read a stat before that it said most Irish people will have experience of at least one person that has either had a termination or been affected by a termination. But in my personal experience, I feel that figure's actually a lot higher. Like, you know, and those stories are not my stories to tell, but I feel like, you know, I know many more people than one.
And I think that's where kind of there are issues, even in terms of kind of figuring out exactly how many people, because people are ashamed, and kind of I'll go into kind of my story later on, but like people are ashamed to tell people, and they're afraid to tell their story. So therefore I'm sure there's lots more people that I know that haven't actually ever told me about their experiences with it, in the same way that I wouldn't necessarily before have told it, like a lot of people that I knew around kind of my story, you know.
Yep. So yeah.
So I guess like kind of into, so in my circumstances kind of slightly different from a lot of kind of Irish women, in that I was living in the UK at that time. I was kind of 22, I was in my second last year in university. I'd been living in the UK for a year, and I was getting out with a guy kind of short term. I'm in a situation where I can't take the pill and things like that, because it kind of leads to depression. So I've tried all sorts of contraceptive options, and unfortunately none of them kind of suit my system. It's something that's kind of hereditary, and that it leads to kind of depression. So my form of contraception then is kind of restricted to using condoms. On one night in particular, didn't use a condom. Hands up, just didn't use one. I'd had a few drinks, it was a stupid mistake, and something that I kind of regretted immediately, and it's not something that would be regular for me. Unfortunately, I fell pregnant as of that. I should have gone for looking back at the time, I should have gone for the morning after pill. It was expensive, I was a minimum wage, supporting myself through college. I kind of cross my fingers and hope for the best, which really isn't something obviously.
Which, to be fair though, when people are 22, happens all the time. And I've definitely, myself and my friends have definitely played Russian roulette in the past, and 9 times out of 10, it's fine.
It's fine.
Yeah.
I was due to come back, it was around May, it would have been, it was 14 years ago now. And it would have been around May, I was due to go back home for the summer, and then kind of after about a week or so, I just knew. I knew I was pregnant. I just knew, and I didn't know how much of that, even looking back, how much of that was just the fear, where you just assumed the worst, and how much of that actually was knowing, and that some part of me knew. So I went and did 5 or 6 pregnancy tests, all of which obviously confirmed kind of what I knew already. Now I thought that being in the UK, it would have been easier for me, it being legal over there, to get a termination, that it would have been easier for me to access it. But it turns out even there it's kind of a socio-economic thing, that when I went to the doctor, they said yes, no problem, it'll take 3 months up to 3 months before we can get you an appointment, because I was going through
3 months?
3 months, they were 12 weeks, it's going to be 12 weeks before you can actually get a termination, because if you're going publicly, if you're going on the free system. So I was obviously devastated by that. I was only kind of
wow, that's shocking. 2
weeks. It was I was totally shocked, and I was completely devastated by it. At this point as well, I hadn't really told. I told 1 or 2 really close friends, but I hadn't really told anyone. I knew now that I was going to have to stay over there for the summer and kind of hide the fact. So I figured out a way that if I went semi-private and borrowed money off my boyfriend's mother at the time, I could go to a consultant, and then that would speed up the process and I could get it done kind of quicker. I mean, ultimately I knew, it was kind of less than 2 weeks into it, I knew I was pregnant. I didn't want to be pregnant anymore, and I thought long and hard about the decision. It wasn't something I came to lightly, but ultimately I knew it wouldn't be right for me to have a baby at that point in my life, because I would have had to drop out of college. And
I'm quite surprised by that, because a lot of the conversation, especially here at the moment, is about timing.
Yeah.
And a lot of the issue seems to be people are like, well, after this time, it's not okay.
It's not okay.
But they're actually holding you up. You've made the decision very early on. Mm-hmm. And they're actually the ones saying, well, you can't get it done for 3 months.
You don't have an appointment, you can't get it done for kind of 12 weeks.
Wow, that is shocking.
And that was obviously really devastating at the time, because I didn't, I'd made that decision, that it was difficult to come to, but I was, clear that was the right decision, and yet I was being stopped by them for it, because of that process. So because I managed to kind of go to the public way, one thing I wanted to be early enough to have a kind of a medical termination rather than the kind of operational one.
So could you maybe explain that a little bit?
So after, again, I'm far from being an expert on it, but if you know early enough, and if you manage to get to the kind of treatment early enough, you can have a medical termination, which involves kind of taking tablets and using pessaries, and essentially it's kind of there's nothing invasive around it. So it's just because if it's at such an early stage. So I was really anxious, obviously, to be kind of, since I knew at such an early stage, to be in that category rather than having to go through anything that was kind of invasive. So I managed to kind of speed up the process, but the whole process still took a month, about kind of 4 weeks, even with going kind of semi-private on the. Of course, if I had plenty of money and I wasn't a college student and I was able to pay for it, I'm sure it could have gone a lot faster than that. But because of the situation I was in, it wasn't.
That's actually something they've brought up today in the Citizens Assembly, is socio-economic reasons, because it is kind of it is available, but only if you have the money.
Only if you have the money, and that's the thing with Ireland, is that I was lucky enough that I was in the UK. But for people who have to pay for flights and have to pay for accommodation and all on top of that, kind of going privately on top of that, the private thing on top of that, then it's an awful lot of money, and not everyone can afford it. So therefore, not everyone even has access to go to the UK, which they shouldn't have to do in the first place. But it's really kind of sad to think that that's a choice that's kind of been taken away from people.
Yep.
And one thing I always say is that I'm not pro-abortion, but I'm 100% pro-choice. It's a decision that somebody has to make for themselves, whether or not it's something that is right for them. But ultimately, it should be their decision. It's their body. It's their choice. And I wouldn't kind of be encouraging anybody anywhere to have an abortion, but ultimately it was definitely the best decision that I made. Even things like the guy I was dating at the time, he kind of dropped me off at the hospital that day and went off to play football, and that just kind of summed up really how this was definitely not a good idea. It would not have been a good idea to continue on and to actually ultimately have a baby with this guy, because it would have just been a terrible choice all around for kind of everybody involved. You know, he wasn't emotionally mature. I probably wasn't emotionally mature enough myself. As I said, I would have had to drop out of university, and I would have been probably move home with my parents, and it just wouldn't have been kind of a good choice. I always look back, I'm 36 now, and I always think, what if now I'm going to be in a position where I can't have children, or if that choice is kind of taken away from me, and would I look back and would I kind of make a change? And I was even thinking about it today before I came over here a lot, and I definitely 100% think that it was definitely the right thing to do, the right thing for kind of everyone involved, as emotionally upsetting as it was. And then the thing is, I've read a lot of stuff over the past kind of few months, past few years in relation to kind of Repeal the 8, of people, kind of trolls on social media and things, saying about how like everybody regrets that decision and people have traumatic effects afterwards. But from the time I made my decision, I never once kind of regretted that, and I think there are a lot of women out there who don't, and it was definitely the right decision for them. Also, I think that the ridiculous claims that people going to use it as a contraceptive option is absolutely ridiculous, because it's not something anyone would make lightly. I mean, there's the emotional consequences of it, but there's also obviously the economic consequences of it, even if it's in kind of even when hopefully it's brought in Ireland, that people can have kind of free enable access to it. I don't see how anybody could use it as a contraceptive choice. It's just a ridiculous argument that kind of comes from the
I imagine it's like, it's even when you know it's the right decision, it's quite a traumatic sort of experience, or like even emotionally so. Like it's not something like, I feel like, you know, it's not as easy as taking the morning after pill, where you go into Boots and you get the morning after pill. It's not like that, and I think that's a total false equivalence when people think that it is. Like, there's a lot more involved in it.
And the worst thing about the whole thing really was, I would say that it was that kind of sense of shame, and a sense that I couldn't really tell people. And I'd be a very open person, I'm really honest, and I I'm an open book, as people that's even blue know me would say. But I couldn't even, I'm really close to my mother, really close, like we're best friends. She's a wonderful woman, really understanding. I still didn't feel at any point that I could actually tell her. And I told her a few years later. We were down at home, we were having a glass of wine, having the chats, and it all just kind of came tumbling out, kind of one after another. And she was so upset that, like, the two of us were crying our eyes out, and she was so upset because I didn't feel like I was able to tell her at that point. I was really upset because looking back, I was like, how could I not have felt I could tell her at that point? But it's that kind of sense of kind of social stigma and shame that I couldn't even tell someone that I'm really, really close to, in case that for fear that you're going to be judged for making a decision about your own body. And ultimately it is your own body, and you should be able to make that choice without fear of reprisal, without fear of kind of negativity. And as I said, I'm not pro-abortion, I'm pro-choice, and it's really important that people feel like they can do that, and that people feel like they have the act, that they're able to talk about it, and that they're able to, because it is a difficult decision to make. So it just even made even more difficult at the moment by the fact that there's that massive sense of shame, and people can't. And I've actually kind of told my story a lot over the past a few years, because since I started marching and Repeal the 8 marches and things like that, because I just think it's really important that people do talk, and that they kind of, as difficult as it was initially, it's kind of getting easier. And to be honest, like, everybody I've spoken to, they've all been really, really supportive, and they've all been really interested as well, to kind of, in terms of the difficulty and the kind of full story and kind of the emotional aspects of it, and even, as you said, the kind of surprising thing about having to wait so long, and all of these kind of details that kind of people don't know, because people are afraid to kind of talk and tell their story. Yeah. And I think not just in the case of, and I know at the moment there's kind of 13 different, as part of the Citizens' Assembly, there's 13 different things they're going to replace the kind of the 8th with. At the moment they're voting, kind of looking at replacing it with kind of 13 different things. But I firmly believe it should not be in our constitution. It really, really shouldn't. It should be a matter of law. It should be a matter of government, like every other law that's kind of applicable in our land. It shouldn't be built in there that something about kind of women's bodies or anything is like the only medical thing in there. So it just makes no sense why this medical issue, which is what it is, should be in there and nothing else is. You know?
Yeah, I find it quite confusing because we have a Protection of Life During Pregnancy Act, and you know it is legislated for already, and it does carry a 14-year sentence here. So it doesn't why is it also in the Constitution? And people, I think that repealing it out of the Constitution would mean there should be a free-for-all. But it actually, what it means is that then it would begin the long process of actually legislating for it or changing existing legislation, so it wouldn't be made legal overnight.
No.
But it just, I'm quite confused by the fact that we're almost double legislating for it, because we've got law and constitution. It makes no sense.
And I think as well, there's a lot of kind of confusion. I would say from the pro-choice side that I've said it to a lot of people that, you know, repealing the 8 and taking out the constitution does not mean that there would be kind of abortion on demand. And people who would be kind of well read and well educated, they were really surprised and shocked to hear that, because they presumed that taking out the constitution, as you said, would mean kind of a free-for-all, and there wouldn't be any kind of conversations in terms of legislating it and things like that, that it would just be automatically legal to do so. And I think making that clear is probably, in terms of the Repeal the 8 movement, like being really clear and open about that fact, and letting people know that it's not the case of, you know, that kind of free-for-all thing.
Yeah.
People are confused.
Yeah, and the difference between, in case anyone is confused watching this or listening to this, the difference is when something is in your constitution, the whole country has to have a vote on even like a terminology change. Whereas if something is in your legislation, it can go through the Oireachtas, you know, the Dáil can enact law. It can be changed a number of different ways without involving a poll vote of the whole country. So it just frees kind of the process up a bit.
Yeah.
Essentially.
Exactly, because I think it's, and just talking to people, I think there's definitely a sense now of kind of a tide turning. But I also think that, like, obviously our history as being a really kind of strongly Catholic country, we are still very much influenced in terms from that kind of Catholic kind of ideology, in particular older generations, but as well as that some of the younger generations. Ultimately, I'm not religious, but I was raised a Catholic, and that kind of led against that increase in self-esteem. And as you were saying earlier on, it's back to the kind of Magdalene laundries and the mother and baby homes, and that kind of sense of shame about women and women's bodies and women's rights, and how that even though we think we're open and we're progressing, like if you're being led by kind of a religious doctrine for kind of, if that's all you're hearing from a really young age, then of course it's going to influence you in terms of kind of your opinions and your views and how you kind of think about things and stuff like that. So it's difficult. And again, I think people that I've spoken to who know people who've gone through having a termination or an abortion are kind of a lot more open to repealing it. But there are a lot of people who don't understand kind of what's involved, and I do understand that it is a complicated thing, and it's not easy. It's not like the marriage equality referendum, because where that was all love.
Yeah, and it's not a yes or no question.
It's not a yes or no.
People need qualifiers, and there's a lot of factors involved. Whereas yes, the marriage equality was like, should we have equality? Yes.
Yeah. And it was a really positive, in terms of, it was really kind of positive story, the marriage equality, and kind of I went around knocking on doors at the time and things like that, and not everyone was positive, but the majority of people were, you know, neutral or positive, you know.
Or open potentially to hearing.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think in terms of kind of, it'll be a different situation when hopefully soon we get kind of the option for a referendum, because it isn't, like in terms of repealing the 8, it is a very emotional subject, and it is something that kind of, as you said, it's not black or white. There's loads of grey areas and people are confused about it, but I do think it's really important that we open up the conversation. It's kind of, when I was travelling there, and a few weeks ago, and I was talking to people about it, and so many people were so shocked that this was still something that's happening in such what's seen as being like a really modern kind of forward-looking country such as Ireland, and that fact that we're still having these conversations when like decades and decades and decades ago the majority of the Western world have kind of legalised kind of abortion, you know. And it's kind of, and I'm so proud of Ireland, and I love Ireland so much, and I think that we're a really kind of open, caring people. So, and I know it really kind of hurts a lot of people that so many women have to go through this and travel to the UK, and not just in the case of in my story, but also in the case of people who have to travel because their baby has died, and they can't get a termination of it here, and they've got to travel over to Liverpool or over to the UK and have that. I mean, like, these people are going through really traumatic, stressful situations already, and it's only kind of adding to
it's compounding it.
and stress. Yeah.
What concerns me, I guess, is well, first of all, ever since in America Trump repealed funding for places that carry out abortions, and I was reading a lot on that, and a lot of studies have actually pointed out that making abortion illegal or harder to get doesn't eradicate the problem. It just makes them more dangerous, because people start doing, like, having back alley abortions or trying to do home abortions, which is really, really dangerous, obviously. I watched an interview with a woman who she told her story that of years and years ago, where she went to Mexico, and she, this was a really harrowing story. I'll find the link and put it down in the description, but it's a really harrowing story, and she was like on the streets of Mexico, basically bleeding, and she was like, am I going to die? Or so it's just like firstly, I feel like that's an important point that needs to be made, because yes, exactly what happens now, women fly to the UK or they figure something else out. Like, there has never gotten rid of the problem just to make it illegal. But the fear I have for a referendum is that while I feel the majority of Ireland is very open and accepting, and we're moving on and we're progressive, I feel like there is a subsection of society. There's probably a lot of people who, unbeknownst to them, carry a lot of things that have been bred into them by the church, like that kind of shame and stuff. But then there's also a subsection who are very vocal and very, and they came out in force during the equality referendum. And the stuff they were saying was actually really nasty and really awful. And I know that they don't see it that way, but I definitely see it that way. And so there's while I understand there's a lot of people who may not be pro-abortion or may not even be pro-choice, but have their reasons for that and are very reasonable people, there's a small element potentially on both sides, but the one I'm quite concerned about is the sort of radical pro-life side, because I feel like it's already such an emotive issue and it affects so many people that I'm really worried about the kind of awful things that could be said. And I feel like during the equality referendum there wasn't enough policing, I guess, of things like banners and campaigns and hate speech. Yeah, so there was things being said that were outright incorrect. One in particular was that allowing two gay people to marry would mean they would automatically be able to adopt. So a lot of people took the no stance because they thought a mother, kids deserve a mother and a father, inverted commas. However, it had already been legislated for a month beforehand that they could adopt.
They could anyway.
So it was like, so it was blatant misinformation on purpose, and that's what really concerns me about having a countrywide vote on something as sort of emotive as this. And that's why I personally feel it will be better legislated for by our legislators. That's what we elect them for, that's what they're there for. And I would like to feel like I could trust them to make a decision that's in my best interest. But yeah, I do want to see the 8th repeal, but I am scared for anyone who's been affected by this issue having to listen to the kind of horrible stuff that I would expect to come out.
Yeah, definitely. I agree 100%. I think that I see it already, as I said, on kind of social media, and any story that has any story that kind of discusses this topic, there's already kind of really kind of emotional and kind of hate-filled speech. And I do think as well that we have to be really careful from the kind of the pro-choice side that we allow people at the same time to have the conversations and to kind of talk things through, because I found that really with the marriage equality as well, that when I was talking to people that were kind of on the fence or leaning more towards kind of no, I think when people were allowed to express their opinion and then have an open kind of conversation about it, and not just say, oh, you're wrong because you have a different opinion to what I have, but if you let people actually kind of talk about their fears, and then you can kind of guide them through, and like if there's kind of misinformation there, then at least you're able to correct it and kind of go, look, that's misinformation. And once you have that conversation, whereas I think sometimes people are so passionate about it that they can shout people down if opinions aren't different from ours, and everyone's allowed to have their own opinion, and that's fair. But I think on both sides we need to be really careful that people are allowed to express those opinions and express those concerns and express those fears.
Yeah. I totally agree.
I think that's really, really important. But I think either way, and even though it's going to be a very, very difficult referendum when it does come around, and it will, and there's no kind of getting away from that. But I think it's really important that we do it and we have that conversation, because we're all talking about it now, and anyway, it's kind of set all over social media, that's all over the news, and the things that are being talked about all the time, and there's protests going on, and clearly there's a large number of people who really want this to change, and who need their voices to be heard. So therefore, I think we need to go kind of sooner rather than later and get this done, because it's not going. And I understand why the government is moving slow on this, because it's as we've said already,
such a divisive
issue, and but at the same time, divisive or not, I think it's something that needs to be done sooner rather than later, because as you said, like, people going to the UK anyway, they're doing it. We're forcing our women to leave the country and go abroad, and that's just not a fair situation for anyone involved.
Yeah, and didn't the UN say that by doing that we're actually violating people's basic human rights? Because when, again, just to explain for people, when Irish women go to the UK to get a termination, they then come home, they don't get access to aftercare. First of all, they haven't been given access, even though they're legally supposed to be. It has come out recently that in a lot of places that are supposed to give impartial information, they're not giving impartial information. So in a lot of cases, they didn't have access to the information beforehand that they should have had, and then when they come back, they are not entitled to aftercare or anything, whether it be physical or mental. So the UN did say that we were actually violating, or the EU said we were violating people's violating people's basic human rights, which is mad, to be honest.
Another kind of big worry that's kind of come out over the last week or so, whatever, is that control that the Catholic Church has over hospitals.
Yes.
And that even when hopefully that the 8th is repealed and it's replaced with legislation that will hopefully kind of allow access to kind of pregnant women, that if so many hospitals are controlled by Catholic organisations, religious organisations, then clearly they're not going to want that to occur in the hospitals that they're controlling. So I think it's really kind of
that's concerning. It's hugely concerning. For anyone who doesn't know, their new National Maternity Hospital is going to be owned by the Magdalene Laundry nuns, which, apart from the glaring problem with that, is that leads into, they're saying that they won't have any say in the goings on of the hospital. But I read an article the other day from a couple of years ago where in the Mater Hospital, 3 board members, one of which was a priest and one of which was a nun, voted to stop these experimental cancer treatments, because people who could potentially get pregnant while on the cancer treatment, they would have had to take contraception. And this was only, I believe, in 2013, and they voted to stop that. So whether or not you're involved in the day-to-day running of a hospital, you can still have a say, and you can, even board members, owners, whatever. So I just find that, that whole thing is very concerning. And when Salvita died, it was said that she was told that it was a Catholic country when they knew that the pregnancy was failing and that she was in trouble. They couldn't just end it and save her. So again, I'll put all the links in the description so that there's kind of you can do a bit more reading on all these subjects, because again, I'm not the best person to get the facts from, but I just it really, that whole thing I find quite scary.
I do too. I just think it's too close a link. I think that we're trying to kind of move away from this kind of this influence of the Catholic Church, and I respect anybody who's religious and they're entitled to be religious, and I wouldn't want to kind of stop people being religious in the slightest, but at the same time we need to separate kind of church and state, and we need to kind of do a lot more in terms of separating that, because not everybody in this country is Catholic, and I think that's like by far, there's loads of people who aren't, and it's all multi-denominational, all sorts of religions, but a lot of people who aren't religious at all, and I just don't think they should have as much influence over kind of my life when it's not something that
exactly.
I kind of believe
like
in,
I mean, if I've no problem with people who are religious, and if that's their thing, that's their thing. But people who aren't shouldn't have the religious ideas forced upon them, and I think that's totally fair. Well, hopefully we'll kind of like all be there to support each other through if it comes to a referendum, and if it ever does get nasty, that all the people on both sides will just support each other through it, and we'll get through it. Do you have any advice maybe for anyone who might kind of might have had an experience but would be afraid to speak out about it, would you have any advice?
Well, my kind of biggest advice, or as I said earlier, one of my biggest regrets was not telling my mother, who was so supportive and is still so supportive and would have been so supportive at the time. My biggest advice really is that people really are supportive. Like, I haven't had any negative reaction, even from people who wouldn't necessarily be pro-choice, that they still haven't been negative at all in terms of when I have told them my story, or when I have kind of talked about it. And I think really, if we really want to kind of progress forward, then more and more people are going to have to start telling their story, because it kind of personalises it and makes it real. It's not just something that's happening on kind of, on a story in a newspaper, but everybody needs to kind of personalise it and put a kind of a face to kind of the struggle that we're having and this fight that we're having,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on and talking about this. And I know this is a very emotive issue and a very divisive issue, and I would ask that anyone wants to get involved in the conversation, especially in the comments on YouTube, if we could just all be respectful of each other's opinions, and just let's discuss it, but let's be respectful, because it is a very divisive and emotional
of course.
topic, but it's very topical at the minute in Ireland, and I think it's on everyone's minds. But thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. So all the links are down in the description. We're on SoundCloud and YouTube, and I'll see you again next week.